Good morning, everyone. I get the sign that we are ready to get started. You know what a really good day looks like? Being in Perugia, the sun is out, you're talking about strategy. Isn't that awesome? And thank you all for being here and being game to talk about strategy and execution at 9:30 a.m. on the first day after probably the first evening for many of you folks at the Brufani bar. So we appreciate it that you made it here. I'd like to briefly introduce my esteemed panel here before we get started. My name is Anita Zielina. I'm the CEO of Better Leaders Lab, a small consultancy and advisory company, and I'm based in Vienna, Austria. To my right, Lucy Küng. Lucy is one of the most renowned strategy experts in media. No, I'm sorry, I say that and I mean it, and I'm not saying it to everyone. She's a board member, for example, at NZZ Media Group. She's a professor. She works with the Reuters Institute, and she's really an expert on the intersection of leadership and strategy. Lucy, thank you for being here. To my left, Michael Trajour. I had the pleasure to work with Michael at NZZ Media Group in the product field. He then went on to the Financial Times, and he has now started his own company, Trust Fund, in the creator economy space that he'll probably touch on a bit later. Michael, so great that you're here. And then you see on the screen behind me, very small in the little corner here, but nonetheless important, Feli Karike, who is the executive director of News Product Alliance. She got up really early for this, so thank you, Feli, for being here, basically almost in the middle of the night, and sadly couldn't be here physically. But Feli is going to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the findings that NPA had about where strategy execution actually falters and fails. So what I'll do, without further ado, is I'll pass it to Feli, who's just going to share a quick overview over some insights. What we tried to do, and that was also the reason behind doing this panel, is we tried to assess and talk to organizations and executives. We all agree, I think, that sometimes strategy fails, fails to get executed. But why does it fail and how does it fail? Before I pass it to Feli, I wanted to wake us up here in the room by asking all of you, whoever was in the position within an organization where there was a strategy, but it didn't get to work, it didn't get executed. Okay, yes. So I'd love to hear just very lightning round from a few of you. Why do you think that was? Just 2-3 words. Can anyone raise their hand and say, why did it fail? Yes? Lack of trust. Anyone else? Timing, wrong timing. Lack of persistence? Yeah. Lack of communication. Short-sightedness. Fantastic. And isn't it nice to share the pain? And I think I saw many nodding heads when you all said that. Feli, talk to us a little bit about some of these elements also show up in some of the work you did with executives for MPA.
Great, yes. Thank you, Anita. Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here and share a bit more about what we're seeing as a disconnect between strategic plans and action plans. So as Anita was saying, at the News Product Alliance, we work with many organizations worldwide to try and translate audience needs into sustainable products and services. And what we are hearing from the organizations that we work with is exactly what you were just sharing. There is a disconnect between this large vision and what actually gets translated into everyday work. So what we've seen is across all of our capacity building programs, most organizations came in with a strategy already defined. However, most of the teams described things such as you just did, like good ideas that took too long to implement. There were unclear objectives at the area level, and there was uneven execution across functions. So what we've seen mostly is a communication problem. There was a like the translation layer between leadership intent and the daily work was absent. And what we saw is that most of these organizations were missing the set of decision making structures and frameworks, routines, and habits that make that strategy something that can be operated on. I'm going to bring an example from one of our programs. For instance, in like entry level surveys, team members, these are the team members like area leaders, not the CEOs, but editors in chiefs, product managers, audience leads. They all listed that they needed clear shared objectives and better cross area communication rituals as the top priorities before going into our program. At the same time, CEOs from those same companies describe their organizations as aligned. And two patterns kept coming up across both of the programs that we are currently running that explain how this gap actually stays in place. So, what we saw was a lack of enforced horizontal coordination mechanisms. So we've seen teams inside the same organization working towards goal they were like seeing and visualizing in a completely different way with no shared language and no enforced coordination mechanisms. So editorial, product, audience, technology, and business teams each had heard the same vision, but they have done it through the filter of their own function and translated into what seemed as conflicting, competing priorities for the works. In one of the programs, we actually asked cross-functional teams to appoint one person as an AI ambassador. This person was supposed to be a person caring and responsible of AI adoption for the organization. And one of the teams could not actually point out who was responsible for AI adoption. Someone thought it was them, but it ended up being an external consultant who only had a temporary contract. So there was clearly no communication in between the different areas that were competing to be the leads this for this area and for this like fundamental task. So there, like what we consistently see is this lack of habits and routines that foster that collaboration. And in our C-suite program, teams said that the most valuable thing we did for them was force them into a conversation between the different areas that hadn't happened in years. That was a feedback that we received consistently from over 30 organizations. And because there are no enforced coordination mechanisms, ownership is assumed as opposed to explicitly assigned. So nothing is actually anyone's problem. And this means each area assumes ownership of results, or nobody does, and defines success very differently. One of the large national legacy outlets in our C-suite program named this very concretely. They had been launching products and establishing indicators and owners and measuring later, after the launch had happened. And several other organizations in the programs had multiple AI initiatives running across different sectors and areas with no shared definition of what those initiatives were supposed to achieve or who was accountable for that result. And the thing is, AI is surfacing these problems faster than any organization can absorb and revealing the management misalignment news organizations had been managing for years. And this is showing up across both programs right now in the C-suite program, multiple organizations came in expecting to work in crafting their strategy and positioning strategy around AI, and discovered during the diagnostic phase that they first needed to fix governance, clarify workflows, and build basic cross-functional accountability structures. So AI was really revealing a misalignment that they had been managing before and that they had to fix if they actually wanted to continue to work in this. And it was the same in the next gen sprint. There was a bit of a difference in the AI readiness coming into that program. Roughly half the cohort had an organization-wide strategy or a dedicated AI lead, but the other half were still at individual scattered experimentation. But even among the more advanced organizations, the sprint surfaced some gaps between teams working on AI in parallel without these shared objectives. So this is kind of like the landscape and what we are seeing from the work that we are doing. But the good thing might be that AI requires a level of internal clarity about ownership and process that most newsrooms have never had to do explicitly. And this transformation is forcing them to do that work. So we are here to discuss a bit more into what that work might look like in the future. So I'll kick it off to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. That was great and very, very insightful. And we thought it would be good to start this panel with some actual kind of facts and what we're hearing in this space, to not just talk in theory about how important the bridging the strategy execution gap is. So what I'd like to get started with is I'd like to hear from Lucy and Michael if you agree with the assessment and if you agree with kind of these two topics of lack of alignment and lack of accountability as being some of the major drivers of that disconnect. Lucy.
This button, right? Yes. Yeah, okay. Really valuable framing from Feli there, I think. And I think a lot of us can respond to what we heard. I mean, I think this discussion, there's two parts. One is looking for cause, trying to understand what is causing this painful situation we're in. And then the second part is kind of solutions or remedies. I see and can echo everything Feli has seen. If I was sort of looking at it from my lens, which is a little bit different because I've done a lot of work on kind of strategy and transformation theory, I think there's a number of kind of structural issues that keep coming up. I think one thing is, particularly for important strategic projects, we tend to over-index on getting the strategy right and put too little emphasis on acknowledging how much work it's going to be to implement it. So we sort of front load. It's really hard to work out what the strategy should be, but we have to realize there's a second half of this that is actually much more complex. And that fantastic German word, Knochenarbeit, just work that goes into the bones to try and make it work. And I think there are many, many different types of strategies and projects, but anything that involves knitting the old part and a new part of the organization together, or involves knitting together bits of the organization, is really, really painful, invisible work. And I think that has to really be acknowledged. So the bigger the dimension of knitting bits of the organization together, the more painful it's going to be, and the more recognition we have to give that. The second thing I see is burnout. I think a lot of individuals in the organizations are burnt out. I think the organizations are burnt out. I think the sector is burnt out. It's been 20, 30 years of unrelenting change and challenge. So there's no reserves, right? Everyone's on the bottom quarter of their battery before they start. And I think that also means we have to look very seriously at these projects and make sure we give them enough resources. I mean, a colleague in the audience talked about time and persistence. That's actually a function of we're overloaded. We've all got too much. And the other thing I see is tremendous overload for leaders in the middle of the organization. They're kind of doing three jobs. They're doing the day job, what they signed up to do, doing great journalism. Often they're doing a lot around keeping up morale, keeping people motivated, and they're doing strategy implementation on top of it. So, and I think that's really, really hard, because often the plan is really elegant and great, but someone's got to do all the granular work about working out, well, how does this actually translate into shifting this process into this process? And that's landing on leaders kind of top middle of the organization who've really overloaded already.
Fantastic assessment, Lucy. Michael.
So I'm gonna, like, in this panel, just like always agree with these three women, because I've learned a lot. I've learned almost everything that I know about strategy from these three women, and the one thing that I want to sort of like emphasize from what Lucy said is sort of like the human aspect, and especially now with AI as well. We can do so much relatively quickly. And the thing that I think we're lacking is kind of like processes to get to the how. Like, how do we decide what to focus on? How do we decide to figure out if it's a success? Like, what are sort of like our success measures? And how do we do that cross-functionally? The other thing that I just want to touch on that was in the presentation from Feli was competing objectives from different teams. And that's not always a problem. That's only a problem if these teams are like super interdependent, right? Like, so what can we do to make teams, especially product teams, free of other teams so that they can deliver end to end? That's such a big part of then also them taking ownership of something, not blaming the other team in the other office for the failure, but actually owning their shit. Teams love to do that if they can. So how can we give them that ability?
Thank you so much, Michael. And I love where this is going with this conversation. And I feel like there is this, what I hear again and again is the importance, and I think we agree on that, the importance of processes and structure and diligent execution. But then I also know when you walk into a newsroom and you say, hey, let's talk about processes and structure, it's like you very rarely get excited yeses. So I think there is an underappreciation in the industry and also within news organizations for diligent execution, for operations, for processes and structures. And that's like biting us now with AI being, not on the horizon, but being here, and structures and processes and so forth become even more important.
I fully agree, and I would go even further and say the problem is actually in sort of like the middle management to top management. There we really need that appreciation for processes and structure, because I think we all in this room will come up with something great to do. So we know what to do if somebody lets us, right? But how do we get there ourselves, with our teams, and as a whole organization? That is something that I think leaders should lose sleep over. Like, don't lose sleep, but think about it hard.
Don't lose sleep.
Never.
Unless you go to the Brew Funny bar, then it's okay to lose sleep for that, but not about execution. Let's move to a little bit of so I think that was a really interesting and deep assessment phase. Let's move a little bit to some of the possible solutions and some of the best practices that we're seeing within the industry, both when it comes to the areas of alignment, but also when it comes to ownership and accountability. Lucy, can I ask you first? Let's maybe start with kind of the alignment, the lack of alignment, the disconnect. What are some solutions that you're seeing or that you're seeing emerge?
I don't know how many people in this room would define themselves as primarily a journalist. Majority or not really? I mean, I think that the challenge here is to recognize, I think, picking up very much on what Michael has said, it's to acknowledge this isn't really a strategy problem, this is a project problem, this is a process problem, actually. Strategy is there, it's probably great. The challenge is viewing this as a project, and it's almost like, and I think people will hate this, but in part of your head you have to forget journalism, forget the mission, look at this as a consultant. Really objectively, look at the challenge in hand. And I think what's incredibly valuable is to really assess it objectively. What kind of project is this? realistically, how feasible is it on a scale of 1 to 10? And if it's really a super stretch, acknowledge that early on and say, okay, what's the minimum we can deliver here and have it work? And I think the other thing, tactically, it's really worth working out who is this project really, really important for, and getting them on your side. You know, one of the best projects I ever saw was at an organization where there was a leader putting through an incredibly difficult project that involved really everyone in the newsroom's job changing a little bit. How they did their work was changing. And she just had a deal with the editor that if someone was really balking at it, that editor would send them an email saying, really sorry to hear you're not on board with this. So essentially, she was doing the heavy lifting, but he had her back. So I think it's really important to know who this matters to and use them to kind of cut through the roadblocks. And I think really also look at what you need to make this work and check you've got the resources at the beginning, because otherwise it's a hiding to a very unpleasant year, 18 months. And it's really worth looking at very objectively at the start as you set it up, I think, which sounds very clinical, very unjournalistic, but we do actually have to. All strategy happens in projects. At the end of the day, you have the paper, but that strategy becoming real, it's a series of projects. And these strategic projects are going to be part of our life if we want the industry to transform. So we actually have to develop the muscle to look at them objectively. And it's not complex. I mean, people in journalism organizations are super smart. They've just got to kind of acknowledge we need to look at this objectively as a project process we need to master.
I think this is such a good point, Lucy, and it makes me think about also how not great we are when it comes to training about basically stakeholder management and managing projects and managing various expectations. And all of this is becoming so much more interdisciplinary, right? Even if you're in editorial, you need to understand product, you need to understand tech, you need to understand sales, you need to understand marketing. And that's just a skill you can learn to manage these interdisciplinary projects, but we're not really teaching that skill, right?
Yeah, and if you think about it, you just need sharp intelligence and communication skills, and journalists have that in spades, right? I mean, they're actually born for this. It's just a matter of putting the power onto this as a challenge, I think.
Michael.
Underlining again, like the communication skills, I think one of the challenges is that the solution for innovation in our companies is going to be cross-functionally developed, right? Like it's not going to be just the newsroom, it's not going to be just the product team, it's not going to be just the marketing team. It needs to be cross-functional, and that requires. These are all like very specific kind of, like teams, right? Journalists, weird people. Product people, weird people. Everybody is like quirky and like has their own kind of like way of working, and we need to sort of like align that. And the thing that people actually reliably aligned around quite effectively is problems, much more than solutions. And I would challenge top leadership, but also like middle management, to really communicate problems more than solutions and rally people around. This is the thing that we want to, that we need to sort of like achieve, not do. It's not a list of tasks, but a list of outcomes, not what people have to output, right? Really fall in love with that, because it's really very, very hard. Like, how can you give people goals and achievements that you want them to sort of like go after without telling them what to do? Giving them clear enough boundaries that they have the help, and then the rest is just supporting them in how they achieve it. So really focus on the what and the why, and much less on the how.
And I think that also means a different kind of leadership, right? Because I think leadership in the traditional sense is very much has been tasked with this. Oh, you basically make that laundry list of, here are the 17 to-dos, and then you just deploy it to your team. But in this case, this means much more about like creating the space for your team, creating the boundaries, but then giving freedom and support within those boundaries for the team to actually achieve the results. And I think that's also a tricky issue, because we're still seeing, what I'm feeling in the industry is this disconnect of the leadership we need today and the leadership we have, right? And that's not always the same. Let's just gently put it that way.
like there's also practicalities that are tough. I'm going to go like super niche. Like at the Financial Times, I was working in product. Product usually has goals that are, like you ship every 3 months something like bigger, and every other week something smaller. The newsroom ships multiple times a day, and the FT has a newsroom that is an incredible global operation, works like an army, super like they like that, works very smoothly and it's very oiled. And now I come as a PM and it's like, could you take a week to sort of like work with us on this problem? That's really hard. So I had to work with newsroom leadership to create the space for some of the journalists who wanted to work with us. And then I had to go back to my product team and say, yeah, we can only do that in 2 months. So I have to plan ahead for that space to exist and for everybody to be able to work together. But oh my God, when you achieve that, like when you actually do it and everybody's in that room and develop something together, magic happens absolutely reliably.
Feli, tell us what you're seeing in terms of the alignment issue.
Yeah, I think both Michael and Lucy touched a bit in what we are seeing and saying something very similar, which is we are not going to meet ourselves out of this problem, right? It's not that we're going to get all of the areas together to continue to talk and discuss about cross-functional alignment if we don't do something together and actually put it in practice, either a project or, Michael, as you were saying, like working on a product launch. From a capacity building standpoint, we saw that alignment only became real when there was a concrete shared project forcing it. So we saw a media organization use their 50th anniversary project as an excuse to do it, or a specific product launch. And for instance, in our next gen sprint, the in-person design sprint was the forcing function. And after they get into the practice and into the habit of doing this together, they can, like media organizations can actually understand the value of it and continue to sustain those practice and those habits, because execution is a muscle that requires you to exercise it.
Fantastic point, Feli, and I love that quote. I think we have to print it on a T-shirt somewhere. We're not going to meet ourselves out of this problem. We're possibly going to create ourselves or design ourselves or do ourselves out of this problem, but not going to meet ourselves. So that is a really thoughtful point. We're going to do a round on the second element on lack of accountability, lack of ownership, and then we'll open it up for questions. So you can already think about questions that you might have in the audience. Lucy.
Yeah, I mean, I think. It's very big. I mean, I think if the setup is clean, the accountability, the ownership has to be clean. I mean, the problem I see with a lot of these projects is when they work, and this is the really painful thing, you start to get strategic creep. Because this is a project that's working, this is a team that seems to be going really well. So people say, maybe we'll just throw this into it as well, actually, because they're really nailing it here. And then you find the whole thing's turned into a kind of strategic puddle, and that beautiful clarity and that muscle that Felia was talking about is kind of weakening. So this is why I really think it's important to look at this objectively the whole time and keep an eye on the prize. And really, if it is succeeding, don't let it creep. Don't let any other goals be thrown at it. And I think the other flaw issue is often these strategic lists are just too long. The to-do lists are too long. And I think there's huge benefit. You know, Anita, you talked really powerfully just now about the importance of creativity, putting a group together and giving them space to experiment. You can't do that if you're pressed in with too many projects. And I think there's a real need actually to reduce the strategic to-do list, get some off the list to create some mind space to really start being creative about the next crop of challenges.
One thing that you observe in journalism companies, and I wonder if you agree, you have more experience there, but I have never seen a journalism company led by a team. It's usually like one like big star, like the editor in chief, and then maybe it's a CEO, but like a cross-functional team that is visibly cross-functional and visibly works together and sort of models how stuff is owned across functions. I would wish for that because a lot of that can trickle down. That's how you want your teams to work as well, right? And actually, because one of them is here, I work on the board of a Swiss politics magazine that is amazing, and they have just started that. So they now have a leadership team that is fully cross-functional. There's the product, the CTO, a product person. There's obviously the editor-in-chief, the co-editor-in-chiefs, and the executive director, and they visibly work together to formulate the goals and that kind of stuff. That could be one approach for teaching people.
And it's so rare. So it's not like a usual thing that we're seeing, even executive teams or C-level where you, from the outside, would think they're aligned. I mean, for us, like who are in boardrooms and in management meetings, I very rarely see a C-level team that's like where editorial, product, tech, business is fully aligned.
Yeah, when I did that book, Hearts and Minds, looking at the kind of human side of digital transformation, that was really a big finding in leadership. There is a huge upward delta if that top team functions as you, Anita, and you, Michael, are talking about. It's really, really hard to build that team right because actually, each one needs to be an expert in their field, have total mastery of their field, but on top of that, they have to have each other's backs. So they're not just defending their unit or function, making sure that things are going well, they're taking care of other people's functions as well. They sort of see it as a collective endeavor, but it's really difficult to change people out at that top level, right? I mean, even if the CEO acknowledges it's necessary, it's hard to find the people, it's uncomfortable to let colleagues you've worked with for a long time go. It's not that they're not performing well, it's just you've increased the ask or you've changed the ask. So yes, it is super rare if you can pull it off, and of course in the Nordics we see it happening, of course, always. But you know, I've been a bit involved in some of those changes in the Nordics. It's a really long process, identifying what's needed, changing people around in a kind of diplomatic way. But you're so right. I mean, the uptick, if you can get, because essentially what they're doing is they're modeling the behavior and the collaboration and the shared accountability that then everyone else down in the organization models. So it's a huge unlock, but it's hard to do.
And I wonder, I've been thinking a lot about when I see that in organization where it works, and the Nordics I think are a great example. What I usually see is that there is C-level leadership that's somehow low ego, and willing to have someone else, be the star of the party, for a while. And I think that is something that really makes a difference. Huge.
I think the men in the room should hear this. It's really, really important. I know this from myself as well, but it is so, so important. And I actually experienced this myself when I was working at Twitter. We had an executive leadership team. They not only had each other's backs, I'm sure like behind the scenes they fought all the time, but to the team and to us, they had each other's backs and they celebrated each other's sort of like unique skills. And that had an effect on the entire company. Like every team had a cross-functional leadership team. So that it's true trickle-down economics.
Yeah. Right. Feli, what are your thoughts on the ownership part?
I think there's something about ownership that, again, yes, it requires a huge lot of coordination at the leadership level to establish what success looks like and who owns which part of it across areas. But there's also something that we see, and it's not everyone is used to working that way. And there is a knowledge gap there. We're talking about setting objectives, following through, establishing rituals, establishing communication that goes from leadership to middle management to operations. And all of that requires a know-how and requires a discipline that not everyone is fully bought in or has had experience doing. And again, I see a knowledge gap there in the industry that requires us to continue to fill it, both with leadership and strategy training, but also product and generally a lot of management work as well.
That you wake up one morning and you're a good project manager, and you're a good, execution, like bridging the strategy execution gap person. Like that's a skill you can learn. Some might be naturally more, apt in doing it than others. But I think we need to accept that this is something that we need to prioritize. We're going to move to audience Q&A. We're going to have a microphone here so that we have the audience questions on the recording as well. The colleague back here has a microphone, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and they'll get to you. We have one question here in the back.
Thank you. This was an incredibly insightful panel. I think I found myself nodding along with everything. I had a question for Lucy.
You want to tell us who you are, just so that we also...
Yes, of course. My name's Aman Sethi. I'm the editor-in-chief and acting CEO of Open Democracy, a London-based not-for-profit. I wanted to maybe just pick on something that Lucy said quite early on, where she said, we tend to front-load the strategizing, which really spoke to me, because at what point, because you'll only know whether the strategy is working if you execute or try to execute it. But what I found in experiences is that people are always asking you to overspec that piece of it, where they're just like, but have you thought of this piece, or have you thought? So how do you come up with strategy that is, I guess, elegant and robust enough that you can iteratively test it out without it feeling like it's too thin? Is any of this making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think both Anita and Michael talked about the importance of communication. I think, there are only a few great strategy gurus. One who did a lot on transformation is Michael Kotter, and he was in the 80s. A lot of the greats were in the 80s, and he talked about the fact that we under-index communication around big change by a factor of 10. We think, how can these people not know this? I have said it so many times. You will be surprised, because everyone's head is busy, right? We've all got 101 things going on. So I think that's partly, there is a communication issue that's really critical, really ironic in media organizations, that perhaps communication is not, internal communication is not as strong as it should be. Outwardly, it's amazingly professional and, best in the world. But I think your issues really concerns the content of your strategy, right? So the big split is between the content of the strategy and the process of doing strategy. So you're talking about the content of the strategy. I think the simpler the better, right? And my guide for what I've seen again and again, strategies that really work, they make amazing intuitive sense to everyone in the building. They are grounded in the realities of the environment. I mean, any strategy is really trying to help an organization master the world it finds itself in, right? So it has to be grounded in a shared understanding of this is the world we're facing right now. But it needs to make sense. And the point you need to get to is that people basically say to themselves, I really don't like where this is taking us, but I kind of get why it's necessary. And when you get that, the breakthrough you get there is that people are prepared to countenance things that maybe aren't in their total personal interest. They kind of get the logic, and the advantage in news organizations is people are very intrinsically motivated. They care about the mission. So if you frame it and legitimately, honestly, this is going to help us do what we want to do and ensure we can do it and deliver inform people in the way we want to do that. I think that can cut through. But I think often strategies are very overcomplex. They need to come down to a set of very simple principles. This is where the positioning is. And they need to have boundaries. We're doing this, we're not doing that. And the idea you want to get to is they kind of get into people's heads like a kind of internal protocol. People know automatically this is the direction of travel. We're not doing this anymore. We're focusing on that. But it's less is more, really. I mean, what was that great comment? If I had more time, I would have written less. It takes a lot of effort to get the strategy down to that. But a lot of the processes that we've been talking about here in terms of pulling it apart in a group to make sure it makes sense. I mean, I think when Mark Thompson was redoing the strategy for the New York Times with the paywall, he had a meeting, I think, with the strategy group every Friday afternoon, week after week after week after week, till they'd pulled it apart and everyone was convinced this is the way to go. And that's kind of the approach.
And I'll just second what Lucy said here. I think what I'm seeing in good, C-level and good CEOs is they don't add to the noise, they reduce the noise. They prioritize, they create clarity, and they reduce the noise. And I think if you can do that, it's a good path to success. Further questions? We have one here in the middle.
Yeah, thanks a lot for speaking from the heart of somebody who's also had the job of doing transformation. I'm Leon from Crowd Reporter, CEO. Somebody said beautifully, the pain is where you try to knit the new into the old, right? And I'm wondering, there is a completely different strategy that other companies have outside the media industry, which is not trying to do that and just placing the new really far away from the old, so you don't have that gravitational pull of producing some like the old thing every day, right? And that's a strategy we're not really seeing a lot in the media industry, despite people being burned out from transformation. And I'm wondering whether you have sort of ideas on why that's not happening, and just thoughts about that alternative strategy. Because from my experience, building something new when you're hiring somebody new for a job and they don't have their legacy job, that's a beautiful thing to do, and it creates so much joy.
It's interesting that you think that that's not happening in the media industry, because in my experience, it actually happens quite a lot, that people and executives are like, oh man, like we're not getting there with like our old team. Let's just hire a new team and tell them, so you now do this like innovation thing. Like I was in digital teams sometimes. I was like, what is that even? And I think it's risky because you're not doing transformation, but you might learn something really important to do transformation. You can make a case. I run a startup now. It's lovely to like start from the blank page and like just rethink everything. But that's not going to transform an organization that needs transformation. So I think it's a little bit risky, and it needs to sort of like, you need to strategically decide this is something for like a completely separate new team far away, as you say, and this is something that we actually need to change the core.
And I will just add to that, I'm actually also seeing that quite a bit, that it happens when you look at some of the large corporates. They've built these like buy boats. They either acquired, when the New York Times is acquiring Wirecutter or The Athletic, that's one of these things. When some of the German big publishing houses built their kind of digital hubs or whatever. So it is happening, but the issue, and there's actually a ton of research out there on that, like dual transformation and the pros and cons, and the ambidextrous organization, where you have like the core that's moving slow and then build that fast buy boat. The painful point comes when you ask yourself, like, how are we gonna integrate that back? Like, is that new cool thing gonna influence the core of our organization? And I think one answer might be, no, it's not. And the cool new thing is at some point gonna become the big thing, and the old thing, we just let that die. But that's a hard decision, right? So I think that integration effort is the painful part that I'm seeing. We have time for one more question. We have time for two very fast questions. Let's do these two because they were the first ones. Third row and then first row, but let's be quick.
Right. All right. So I'll keep my question quick. Lucy, you talked about people being burned out in newsrooms because we've seen so many changes over the years in journalism and the broader information ecosystem, and especially about how the middle management is is burned out. So how do you deal with that? How do you help them in those kinds of situations, or in that situation we're in?
Hi, Sophie.
Hi, my name's Sophie.
I think it is an endemic problem, and I think we have to acknowledge it's a problem. And picking up what Anita said, but creativity theory. I mean, one of the most powerful concepts in creativity theory is this concept of threat rigidity. I don't know how many of you know this, but essentially, when you are under so much threat, under so much pressure, you are incapable of thinking creatively. You will get the work done, you will deliver, you will do what's on the list, but there'll be no kind of combining things in an interesting way, breakthrough thinking. And that's essentially, I think, a lot of where the industry's got to. And that's why we keep landing on other people's recipes rather than creating our own, because we just don't have that creative capacity. So that's why I really care so much about reducing the strategic to-do list. There's too much on it. Like, it's, I love the sprint, the 3-month sprint, the 6-month sprint. We get these two things off the list, we create some air. And I think actually, absent a huge influx of new resources, new teams, new money, whatever, which I think would be great, it's unrealistic. I think that's kind of what leaders need to do, kind of, reduce the to-do list.
Just +1ing this actually happened at the FT while I was there. One of our product leaders, one of the top product leaders, ran around for a year only saying the sentence, let's do fewer things, faster, better. For a whole year, I heard that sentence every week, and it worked.
Quick question, quick answer. I don't know where the microphone is. First row. Okay.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm the CEO and founder of SamHub, and I started working in media in 2008. And my first job was to drive digitalization in a local media house. It was a nice first job. And I experienced a great resistance internally from journalists, from the B2B sales, B2C sales. And there's a saying that culture beats strategy every day of the week. So my question is, how can you beat the cultural resistance in a media house?
You can't. You cannot. But people can, and I think there's an especially big responsibility that is undervalued on editors and journalists. They have the most power in journalism organizations for a good reason, and they need to carry the innovation. So make best friends with them. I think that's something that you can do.
Change management is part of it, yeah, and it's hard, and I think we all know that. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank my fantastic panelists, including Feli, who hopefully now goes back to take an early morning nap. Thank you, everyone. This was fantastic, and enjoy your Perugia.
And thank you, Anita. Brilliantly done. Thank you.